When Mara Whitlock stood in front of the bank manager with empty pockets and a loaded pistol on her hip, she knew the entire town was betting on her failure. Her father's sudden death had left her with a dying ranch, crushing debt, and a territory full of men who believed a woman's place ended at the kitchen door. But Mara had inherited more than land. She had inherited rage, stubbornness, and a refusal to disappear quietly. The summer of 1878 would decide everything, whether she would break under pressure or break every rule that tried to bury her. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Mara's fight travels. Hit that like button and let's ride this story together to the end. The dust came first, then the whispers. Mara Whitlock stood on the sagging porch of her ranch house, watching the horizon shimmer under a sky that hadn't offered rain in 6 weeks. The cattle were thin. The grass was brown. The fence posts leaned like drunk men trying to hold each other upright. Behind her, the house creaked in the wind, a 2-story frame structure her father had built with his own hands 20 years ago, back when Colorado Territory still felt like a promise instead of a punishment. She was 24 years old, alone, and running out of time. Her father had been dead 3 months. Heart gave out in the middle of branding season, dropped him right there in the dirt with a rope still in his hand. The funeral had been small. A few neighboring ranchers showed up out of obligation, hats in hand, eyes already calculating how soon they could make an offer on the land. The preacher spoke about eternal rest. Mara had stood there thinking about debt, about the herd that needed selling, about the loan payment coming due in September. She hadn't cried. Not then, not since. Now it was July, and the heat was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders, soaking her shirt, turning every breath into work. She wore men's trousers because skirts were useless on a ranch, and her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that hung halfway down her spine. Her hands were calloused, her skin tanned darker than any respectable woman should be, and her mouth had a habit of saying things that made the church ladies clutch their pearls. Red Hollow didn't know what to do with her. The town sat 5 miles east, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single main street like teeth in a crooked jaw. It had a bank, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church, and enough gossip to fuel a wildfire. When Mara rode in for supplies, she could feel eyes tracking her, women turning away with tight lips, men smirking behind their mustaches. They talked about her father, about how he'd spoiled her, let her run wild, taught her to ride and rope instead of cook and sew. They talked about her riding alone, working alongside hired men, speaking her mind in public. They called her improper, unnatural, a shame. Mara didn't care what they called her. She cared about keeping the ranch alive. But caring wasn't enough. 3 days ago, she'd ridden into town to check on the loan her father had taken out 2 years back. Money borrowed to survive a hard winter and a summer drought. She'd walked into the Red Hollow Bank with her hat in her hand and hope in her chest, thinking maybe she could negotiate an extension, buy herself time to sell the herd at a decent price in the fall. The bank manager, Gerald Pritchard, had looked at her like she was a child asking for candy. "Miss Whitlock," he'd said, smoothing his oiled hair with one pale hand, "I'm afraid the terms of the loan are quite clear. Payment in full is due September 1st. That's 6 weeks from now." "I know when it's due," Mara had said. "I'm asking for more time. The market's bad right now. If I can hold off till October, the bank cannot extend credit indefinitely." His smile was thin, polite, and utterly final. "Your father understood the risks when he signed the papers." "My father's dead." "Yes. Tragic." Pritchard folded his hands on the desk. "Which is why I feel it's my duty to be honest with you. Running a ranch is difficult work, Miss Whitlock. It requires experience, capital, and, forgive me, a certain physical capability. Perhaps it would be wiser to consider selling now, while you still have options." Mara had felt heat crawl up her neck. "I'm not selling." "Then you'll need to make the payment, in full, September 1st. He'd opened a drawer, pulled out a paper, slid it across the desk. $2,000. The number had hit her like a fist. She'd ridden home in silence, the paper folded in her pocket, her mind doing math that wouldn't balance. The ranch had maybe 300 head of cattle, but in this market, with the drought-killing grazing land across the territory, she'd be lucky to get $6 a head. That was $1,800. She'd come up short, and that wasn't even accounting for the cost of driving the herd to market.
feeding her crew, keeping the ranch running while she was gone. She was going to lose everything, unless she didn't. Mara turned away from the horizon and walked back inside. The house was dim and hot, smelling of dust and old coffee. Her father's rifle still hung over the fireplace. His boots sat by the door. She hadn't moved them, hadn't moved much of anything. The silence in the house was thick, and sometimes late at night she still expected to hear his voice calling her name. She poured herself water from the pitcher on the table, drank it in 3 long swallows, then grabbed her hat and headed for the barn. Tomas Valles was already there, mending a bridle in the shade. He was 52, compact and weathered, with silver threading through his black hair and a scar across his left eyebrow from a bad fall 15 years back. He'd worked for Mara's father since before she was born, and when the old man died, Tomas had stayed without being asked. He was the foreman, the only steady hand left on a ranch that couldn't afford to pay him what he was worth. He looked up as Mara approached, his dark eyes sharp. "You got that look." "What look?" "The one that means you're about to do something stupid." Mara almost smiled. "I need to go into town. You need anything?" "Nails. Wire if they got it." He set the bridle aside. "You going to the bank again?" "No." She pulled on her gloves. "General store." Tomas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Don't start any fights." "I never start them." "You sure as hell don't walk away from them either." This time she did smile, brief and sharp. Then she saddled her horse, a rangy buckskin mare named Cinder, and rode east toward Red Hollow. The town shimmered in the heat, wavering like a mirage. Mara tied Cinder to the rail outside the general store and stepped inside, grateful for the shade. The store smelled like tobacco, flour, and old wood. Shelves lined the walls stocked with canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, ammunition. Behind the counter stood Howard Bly, the owner, a narrow man with a narrow face and a habit of looking at Mara like she'd tracked mud across his floor. "Miss Whitlock," he said without warmth. "Mr. Bly." She pulled a list from her pocket. "Need supplies." He took the list, glanced at it, then set it down. "You settling your account first?" Mara's jaw tightened. "I'll settle it when I sell the herd. That's what you said last month, and I'll say it again next month if I have to." She met his eyes. "You'll get your money, Howard." "It's Mr. Bly," he said primly, "and I'm running a business, not a charity." Before Mara could respond, the door opened behind her and 2 men walked in. She recognized them both, Cal Drummond and his son Ethan. The Drummonds owned a spread north of hers, bigger, better watered, more cattle. Cal was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Ethan was younger, mid-30s, handsome in a cold sort of way, and he'd made it clear more than once that he thought Mara would make a fine wife if she'd just stop pretending to be a rancher. Cal tipped his hat. "Miss Whitlock, didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't know I needed permission." He chuckled, the sound rolling out of his chest like stones down a hill. "Still got that sharp tongue, I see. Your daddy ever teach you manners?" "He taught me to stand up straight and look a man in the eye." Mara held his gaze. "I'm doing both." Ethan stepped forward, his smile tight. "We heard you've been having some trouble with the bank." "You heard wrong." "Come on, Mara." He leaned against the counter, too close. "Everybody knows you're underwater. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Ranching's hard. Your daddy knew that, and he was a man with 20 years' experience. You're just a girl trying to do a man's job. I'm a rancher. You're a woman playing dress-up." Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I'm trying to help. My father and I have been talking, and we're prepared to make you a fair offer. You sell us the land, we'll pay off your debt, and you can move into town. Find something more suitable." "I'm not selling." "You don't have a choice," Cal said, his voice gentler but no less firm. "September's coming. You can't make that payment. We both know it." Mara felt her pulse hammering in her throat. "I'll make it." "How?" Ethan laughed, short and mean. "You planning to rob a stage?" The store had gone quiet. Howard Bly stood behind the counter, watching with obvious interest. A woman browsing fabric near the back pretended not to listen while leaning closer. Mara felt the weight of their attention, the hunger for drama, the expectation that she would crack. She didn't. I'll drive the herd north, she said. Cheyenne. Market's better up there. Cal's expression shifted, surprise bleeding into concern. That's 200 miles through rough country. You got any idea what you're talking about? I know exactly what I'm talking about. You got a crew? Supplies? Experience running a trail drive? I've got Tomas. I'll find the rest. Ethan snorted. You and an old man and whatever drifters you scrape off the saloon floor. That herd'll scatter halfway there and you'll end up dead in a ditch. Then I'll die with my boots on instead of my dignity in your pocket. The words came out harder than she intended, sharp enough to cut. Ethan's face darkened. Cal's mouth tightened. For a moment, Mara thought one of them might say something worse, something that would force her hand, make her do something she couldn't take back. Then a voice spoke from the doorway, calm and low. Sounds like she's made up her mind. Everyone turned. The man standing in the entrance was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled the frame and a build that spoke of years spent working hard. He wore a dusty brown coat, a battered hat, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. His face was lean and weathered, maybe 35, with blue-gray eyes that seemed to take in everything without hurry. He had the look of someone who'd traveled far and carried his past lightly. Mara didn't recognize him. Neither did anyone else, judging by the silence. The stranger stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him. He nodded politely to Howard Bly. Afternoon. I'm looking to buy some supplies, trail rations mostly, bacon, beans, coffee. Howard blinked, caught off guard. Yes, of course. The stranger's gaze shifted to Mara, then to Ethan and Cal. Didn't mean to interrupt. Oh, you didn't, Mara said, before either of the Drummonds could speak. We were just finishing. Ethan straightened, his jaw tight. We're not done. Yeah, Mara said. We are. She pushed past him, heading for the door. As she reached it, the stranger stepped aside, giving her space. Their eyes met for half a second, his steady, unreadable, somehow respectful, and then she was outside, blinking in the harsh sunlight. Her hands were shaking. She hated that. Hated that Ethan Drummond could get under her skin. Hated that the whole damn town treated her like a problem to be solved or a joke to be laughed at. She untied Cinder with more force than necessary, swung into the saddle, and was about to ride off when the door opened again. The stranger stepped out, a sack of supplies under one arm. He glanced at her, then tipped his hat. Ma'am. Mara hesitated. You're new. Just passing through. Long way to pass through. She studied him. Where you headed? North, maybe Wyoming. Haven't decided yet. Looking for work? He paused, something shifting in his expression. Depends on the work. I'm running a cattle drive to Cheyenne in 2 weeks. Need hands. Mara kept her voice level. Pays not much, but it's honest. The stranger considered this. You the one they were talking about in there? Probably. They think you're going to fail. Yeah, they do. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from her face to the horizon and back again. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. All right. Mara blinked. All right? I'll work your drive. He shifted the sack to his other arm. Name's Rhett Mercer. Mara Whitlock. I figured. He almost smiled. When do we leave? 2 weeks. You'll need to come out to the ranch tomorrow. 5 miles west, follow the creek. I'll be there. He turned and walked toward the livery, his stride easy and unhurried. Mara watched him go, something uncertain stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite relief, but close enough to both that it scared her. She rode home under a sky the color of old brass, thinking about desperation and strangers and the line between courage and stupidity. The next morning, Rhett Mercer arrived at dawn. Mara was already up, feeding the horses, when she heard the sound of hooves on the hard-packed dirt. She turned to see a tall figure riding in on a big gray gelding, the early light turning everything soft and golden. Rhett dismounted smoothly, tied his horse to the rail, and walked toward her with the same calm deliberation she'd noticed the day before. Morning, he said. You're early. Habit. He glanced around, taking in the barn, the corrals, the house with its peeling paint and sagging porch. If he judged what he saw, it didn't show on his face. Where do you want me to start? Mara wiped her hands on her trousers. You ever run cattle before? Yeah. Where? Texas, New Mexico, Kansas for a while. He met her eyes. I know the work. Good, because I don't have time to teach you. She pointed toward the barn. Tomas is inside. He'll show you around, get you settled. We've got a lot to do before we leave. Rhett nodded and headed for the barn. Mara watched him go, then forced herself back to work. She had too much on her mind to spend time wondering about a drifter who might not even stay the week. But Rhett stayed. He worked quietly, steadily, without complaint. He mended fences, checked the herd, helped Tomas with the branding iron and the water troughs. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were direct and without decoration. He listened more than he spoke, and when Mara gave orders, he followed them without question or ego. Tomas liked him. That alone was worth something. He knows his way around cattle, Tomas said on the third day, leaning against the fence while they watched Rhett work a skittish calf. Moves like someone who's been doing this his whole life. He say where he came from? No, and I didn't ask. Tomas glanced at her. You worried? Mara shrugged. I'm always worried. He's a good hand. That's what matters. She supposed it was. The days blurred together, long, hot, exhausting. Mara threw herself into the work with a focus that bordered on obsession. She and Tomas and Rhett rode the range, counting cattle, checking brands, making sure the herd was healthy enough for the drive. They gathered supplies, flour, beans, coffee, bacon, dried apples. They repaired tack, sharpened knives, checked the wheels on the supply wagon. Every night, Mara sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper, doing math that refused to balance, planning a route that seemed impossible. 200 miles, rough terrain, rivers to cross, weather that could turn in an instant, wolves, rustlers, exhaustion, accidents. 100 things could go wrong, and most of them would. But the alternative was losing the ranch. So she kept planning. One evening, a week before they were set to leave, Mara stood on the porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The air was cooling, finally, and the light had that soft amber quality that made the whole world look gentler than it was. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Rhett climbing the stairs, his hat in his hand. Tomas says we're about ready, he said. Close. Mara crossed her arms. Still need to hire 2 more hands. Nobody in town wants the job.
Because they think you'll fail. Yeah. Rhett leaned against the railing, his gaze on the horizon. Why do you care what they think? I don't. Then why are you still here? You could sell, take the money, start over somewhere else. Mara's jaw tightened. This is my home. It's land. It's more than that. She turned to face him. My father built this place. Spent 20 years turning dirt into something real. He died trying to keep it alive. I'm not going to let a bunch of small-minded bastards take it away just because they think I'm not strong enough. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're strong enough. The words were simple, matter-of-fact, and they hit her harder than she expected. You don't know that, she said. Yeah, I do. He said it like it was obvious, like there was no room for argument, and Mara felt something in her chest crack just a little, something that had been locked tight for months. She looked away, swallowing hard. Why'd you take the job? Needed work. There's work everywhere. Why this? Rhett considered the question. Because when I walked into that store and saw you standing up to those men, you reminded me of someone. Who? Doesn't matter. She's gone. He put his hat back on. Point is, I know what it looks like when someone's fighting a losing battle because it's the only fight worth having. I figured you could use someone in your corner. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They stood there in the gathering dark, the silence between them comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. Finally, Rhett straightened. I'll see you in the morning. Yeah. He walked down the stairs and across the yard toward the bunkhouse. Mara watched him go, then turned back to the horizon, where the last light was fading into blue. She thought about losing battles and corners, and the strange comfort of having someone believe in her when the whole world didn't. Then she went inside, pulled out her maps, and kept planning. 2 days before the drive, everything went wrong. Mara rode into town alone, needing to pick up the last of the supplies and settle her account with Howard Bly. She tied Cinder outside the general store and walked in, braced for another fight. Howard was behind the counter, sorting mail. He looked up as she entered, his expression flat. Miss Whitlock?
I'm here for my order. Order's ready. He gestured to a stack of crates near the door. That'll be $42. Mara handed over the money, cash she'd scraped together by selling off tools and tack she couldn't afford to lose. Howard counted it twice, then nodded. You're square, for now. Good. She started loading the crates onto her arms when the door opened and Gerald Pritchard walked in, his suit pressed and his expression pleasant. He saw Mara and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Whitlock, how fortunate. I was just about to ride out to your ranch. Mara set the crate down. What for? Pritchard pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. I'm afraid there's been a change to the terms of your loan. Her stomach dropped. What change? The bank has decided to accelerate the payment schedule. The full amount is now due August 15th. Mara stared at him. That's 2 weeks. Yes. The original date was September 1st. The original terms were drafted when your father was alive and the ranch was solvent. Pritchard's smile never wavered. Given the current circumstances, the bank feels it's prudent to adjust the timeline. That's not legal. It's entirely legal. Your father signed a promissory note with a clause allowing the bank to call the loan early under certain conditions. I'm invoking that clause. Mara's hands curled into fists. You're doing this because I won't sell to the Drummonds. I'm doing this because the bank has a fiduciary responsibility to protect its investments. Pritchard tucked the envelope back into his pocket. If you cannot make the payment by August 15th, the property will be foreclosed and sold at auction. You have 2 weeks, Miss Whitlock. I suggest you use them wisely. He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Mara standing in the middle of the store with rage boiling in her chest. Howard Bly cleared his throat. You all right? No? She grabbed the crates, hauled them outside, and loaded them onto Cinder with shaking hands. 2 weeks. They'd moved the deadline by 2 weeks, which meant she had to leave immediately. No time to hire more hands. No time to prepare properly. No time to do anything except run. It was a trap, and she'd walked right into it. Mara rode home fast, her mind racing. When she reached the ranch, she found Tomas and Rhett working near the barn. She dismounted, dropped the reins, and told them everything. Tomas swore in Spanish. Rhett's expression darkened. They're trying to bury you, Tomas said. Yeah. Mara paced, her boots kicking up dust. We leave tomorrow, no choice. We're not ready, Tomas said. We don't have enough hands. The herd's not even fully gathered. Then we gather them tonight and ride out at dawn. Mara, I'm not giving up. She stopped, turned to face them both. I'm not letting them win. If we leave now, we might make it. If we wait, it's over. Thomas looked at Rhett. Rhett looked at Mara. All right, Rhett said quietly. We ride tomorrow. And so they did. The drive began in chaos. They managed to gather most of the herd by midnight, around 280 head, restless and edgy after being rounded up in the dark. Mara, Tomas, and Rhett worked through the night, barely sleeping, and when the sun rose on August 1st, they started moving north. It was immediately clear that 3 people were not enough. The cattle spread out, testing boundaries, breaking away in small groups that had to be chased down and driven back. Mara rode the left flank, Rhett took the right, and Tomas brought up the rear, all of them shouting, whistling, pushing exhausted animals through miles of scrub and rock. The heat was brutal. The dust was worse. By midday, Mara's throat was raw, and her eyes burned, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. They didn't stop. They pushed through the afternoon, covering maybe 8 miles, and when the sun finally set, they made camp near a shallow creek. Tomas started a fire. Rhett checked the horses. Mara collapsed against a rock and stared at the stars, too tired to think. You all right? Rhett's voice, low and close. She opened her eyes. He was crouched beside her, holding out a tin cup of coffee. She took it, grateful. I'm fine. You look like hell. So do you. He almost smiled. Fair enough. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee that tasted like dirt and heat. Around them, the cattle shifted and lowed, restless in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. We're not going to make it, Mara said quietly. Yes, we will. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. Rhett set his cup down. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met.
You'll drag this herd to Cheyenne out of sheer spite if you have to. Despite everything, Mara laughed, a short, tired sound. Spite's a hell of a motivator. Best one there is.
She looked at him, the stranger who'd walked into her life a week ago and decided to follow her into hell without asking for anything in return. Why are you really doing this? Rhett was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because I spent 10 years drifting, taking jobs that didn't matter, working for people who didn't care. I got tired of it, figured maybe it was time to do something that meant something. This is just a cattle drive. No, it's not. He met her eyes. It's you telling the world you're not going anywhere. That matters. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. They sat together until the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the quiet, Mara felt the weight on her chest ease just a little. Tomorrow would be hard, but tonight she wasn't alone. The second day was worse than the first. They woke before dawn to find that 15 head had wandered off during the night, spooked by something none of them had heard. Mara sent Rhett to track them while she and Tomas pushed the main herd forward, but it cost them 2 hours they didn't have. When Rhett finally returned with the strays, his jaw was tight and his horse was lathered with sweat. Found them in a gulch about a mile back, he said, falling into position beside Mara. Could have broken their legs getting down there.
But they didn't. Not yet. Mara didn't respond. She just kept riding, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the land stretched out in endless waves of brown and gold. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something you could choke on. The cattle moved slowly, their heads low, tongues lolling. They needed water. So did the horses. So did Mara. But wanting it and finding it were two different things. By midday, the heat was unbearable.
Mara's shirt clung to her back, soaked through with sweat. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes burned from the dust that hung in the air like a living thing, coating everything. Her skin, her lungs, her thoughts. She pulled her bandana up over her nose and mouth, but it didn't help much. Tomas rode up beside her, his face gray under the dust. There's a creek marked on the map about 5 miles northeast. We need to water the herd. That'll take us off the main trail.
They're dying of thirst, Mara.
We don't have a choice. She knew he was right. She also knew that every detour cost them time they couldn't spare, but cattle couldn't move if they couldn't drink, and dead animals were worth nothing. All right, she said, we turn northeast. They adjusted course, pushing the herd toward the creek. The cattle sensed the water before they saw it and started moving faster, their exhaustion forgotten in the sudden urgency of thirst. Mara and Rhett rode ahead to scout the crossing while Tomas kept the herd moving. The creek was shallow and narrow, barely 6 feet across, with muddy banks and water that looked more brown than clear. But it was wet, and that was all that mattered. It'll do, Rhett said, dismounting. He knelt by the water, scooped some into his hand, tasted it, made a face. Tastes like dirt. Everything tastes like dirt out here. Fair point. They let the herd drink in waves, controlling the flow so the animals didn't trample each other or foul the water too quickly. It took over an hour, and by the time the last cow had drunk its fill, the sun was starting its slow descent toward the western mountains. Mara filled the canteens, splashed water on her face, and tried not to think about how far behind schedule they were. Tomas walked over, wiping his neck with a rag. We lost another 2 head. Mara's stomach sank. When? While we were watering, saw them break off toward the south. I tried to cut them off, but they were moving fast. Damn it, she looked at Rhett. Go after them. We're losing daylight, Rhett said. If I go now, I won't make it back before dark. Then you ride in the dark. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just swung back into the saddle and rode south, disappearing into the scrub. Mara watched him go, feeling the weight of every decision pressing down on her shoulders. He's right, you know, Tomas said quietly. We're pushing too hard. We don't have a choice. There's always a choice, mija. The question is whether you're willing to live with the consequences. Mara turned to look at him. Tomas had never called her that before. Mija, daughter. And the word landed soft and heavy at the same time. He'd worked for her father for decades, watched her grow up, taught her to rope and ride. He'd buried his own wife 10 years ago and never remarried, never left, just kept working the ranch like it was his own. He was the closest thing to family she had left. I can't lose this ranch, she said. I know. If we turn back now, it's over. I know that too. Tomas folded the rag and tucked it into his belt. But if you kill yourself getting to Cheyenne, what's the point? Your father didn't build this place so you could die defending it. Then what did he build it for? Tomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. He built it so you'd have something worth fighting for. But fighting doesn't always mean charging straight ahead. Sometimes it means knowing when to pull back, regroup, try again. I don't have time to try again. Then we better make sure this works. He walked away before she could respond, heading back to check on the herd. Mara stood alone by the creek, staring at the water, trying to ignore the doubt creeping up her spine. Rhett returned 2 hours after dark, leading the 2 stray cattle by a rope. He looked exhausted, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but he didn't complain, just handed the rope to Tomas and dismounted with a grunt. Lost the light about a mile out, he said, pulling the saddle off his horse. Had to track them by sound.
You find them? Obviously. Mara almost smiled. Thanks. Don't thank me yet. We're still about 170 miles from Cheyenne. I can do math. Just making sure. They made camp without a fire that night, too tired to gather wood and too worried about attracting attention. Mara ate cold beans straight from the can and tried to convince herself it was food. Across the camp, Tomas was already asleep, his hat pulled low over his face.
Rhett sat with his back against a rock, cleaning his rifle in the dim starlight. Mara watched him for a while, then said, "You ever run a drive this small before?" "No." "You ever lose one?" Rhett paused, his hand stilling on the rifle. "Yeah, once." "What happened?" "Stampede. Lost half the herd in a canyon, and the rancher lost his temper. Blamed the crew, didn't pay anybody, left us stranded in the middle of New Mexico with no horses and no money." He went back to cleaning the rifle. "Took me 3 weeks to walk to the nearest town." "That why you drift?" "Part of it." He glanced at her. "You ever think about what you'll do if this doesn't work?" "No." "Maybe you should." "Why? So I can plan my failure?" Mara shook her head. "I don't have a backup plan, Rhett. This is it. If I lose the ranch, I lose everything." "Not everything." "What else is there?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You." The word hung in the air between them, simple and heavy. Mara didn't know what to say, so she just looked away, focusing on the dark shapes of the cattle shifting in the night. "You should get some sleep," Rhett said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be long." "They're all long." "Yeah, but tomorrow's going to be worse." He was right. The third day started with a fight. One of the steers, big, mean, with a scar across its nose, decided it didn't want to move. It planted its hooves in the dirt and refused to budge, bellowing loud enough to wake the dead. Mara tried roping it. Rhett tried pushing it. Thomas tried everything short of dynamite. Nothing worked. Finally, Rhett dismounted, walked straight up to the steer, and punched it in the face. The steer blinked, stunned. Then it shook its head, snorted, and started walking. Mara stared. Did that actually work? "Sometimes you just gotta speak their language," Rhett said, rubbing his knuckles. "Your language involves punching?" "When necessary." Tomas laughed, the first real laugh Mara had heard in days. It was a good sound, and for a moment the weight on her chest eased. They made better progress that day, covering almost 12 miles before the sun set. The land was changing as they moved north, less scrub, more grass, the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking where water ran underground. The cattle seemed calmer, settling into the rhythm of the drive. Even the weather cooperated, the sky staying clear and the wind staying light. Mara let herself hope, just a little. That night, they camped near a dry wash with enough grass to keep the herd happy. Tomas cooked beans and bacon over a small fire while Mara and Rhett checked the horses. The air was cooling, finally, and the stars were so thick overhead they looked like spilled salt. "How much farther to the next town?" Rhett asked, checking his horse's shoes. "About 40 miles. Place called Grafton. We can resupply there if we need to." "We need to." "I know." Rhett straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You ever been to Cheyenne before?" "Once. With my father when I was 12. He sold a herd there, made good money, used it to buy more land." Mara leaned against the fence, her arms crossed. "He told me that day that the ranch would be mine someday, that I'd have to be tough to keep it, but if I was, it'd take care of me." He was right. About which part? Both. Mara looked at him. In the firelight, his face was softer, less guarded. She realized she didn't know much about him, where he came from, what he'd left behind, why he kept moving. He was careful with his words, careful with his past, and she respected that. But part of her wanted to know, wanted to understand the man who'd chosen to follow her into this mess without a second thought. "You got family?" she asked. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Had a sister. She died when I was 19. Fever took her in about 3 days. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He picked up a brush, started working on his horse's coat. "After she died, my father sold the farm and drank himself to death. I left before the funeral, haven't been back since." "Where was home?" "Kansas, little town you've never heard of." He kept brushing, his movement steady and methodical. "I spent 10 years trying to forget it. Worked ranches, drove cattle, built fences, dug wells, moved every time I started to feel settled. Figured if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to think about what I lost." "Did it work?" "No." Mara nodded slowly. "My mother died when I was 8. I don't remember much about her, just pieces. The way she smelled like bread and lavender, the songs she used to sing. My father never talked about her after she was gone, just buried the grief and kept working. I think that's why he pushed me so hard. He didn't know what else to do." "Sounds like he loved you." "Yeah, he did." Mara's throat tightened. "I just wish he'd taught me how to run a ranch without him." "You're doing fine." "I'm barely holding on." "That's what doing fine looks like out here." Rhett set the brush down and turned to face her. "You think your father had it all figured out?" "He didn't. Nobody does. You just keep moving, keep making decisions, keep fighting. That's all any of us can do." Mara wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that survival was enough, that fighting was enough, that she wasn't failing every time something went wrong. But belief was hard when the weight of everything kept pressing down. "Come on," Rhett said, his voice gentler. "Tomas has food ready." They walked back to the fire, where Tomas was already eating, scooping beans onto tin plates. Mara sat down, grateful for the food and the company and the brief illusion that things might work out. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. The herd settled and quiet under the stars. For the first time in days, Mara felt something close to peace. It didn't last. The 4th day brought the storm. It started as a smudge on the western horizon, dark and low, moving faster than seemed possible. Mara saw it first and felt her stomach drop. "Rhett," she called, pointing. He turned, saw the clouds, and swore, "We need to find shelter." "There's nothing out here." "Then we need to move fast." They pushed the herd harder, trying to put distance between them and the storm, but it was like racing a train. The wind hit first, cold and sharp, whipping dust into their faces. Then the sky opened up. The rain came down in sheets, soaking through clothes and skin in seconds. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The cattle panicked, breaking formation, scattering in every direction. Mara shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of the storm. Lightning split the sky, close enough to make the hair on her arms stand up. "Get them moving!" Tomas yelled, his voice barely audible. "Don't let them scatter!" Easier said than done. The herd was chaos. Animals running blind, crashing into each other, bellowing in fear. Mara rode hard, cutting off strays, turning them back toward the center. But for every cow she brought back, 2 more broke away. Her hands were numb, her face stung from the rain. She couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. Then she heard Rhett shout, "Ravine!" Mara's heart stopped. She spurred her horse forward, cutting through the rain, and saw what he meant. Ahead, the land dropped off sharply, a deep cut in the earth hidden by the storm. Half the herd was heading straight for it. "Turn them!" she screamed. "Turn them now!" Rhett was already moving, riding hard along the flank, forcing the cattle away from the edge. Mara came in from the other side, waving her arms, shouting, doing everything she could to redirect the panicked animals. For a moment, it looked like it might work. The cattle started to turn, their momentum shifting. Then lightning struck a tree 50 yards away, the crack so loud it felt like the world splitting open. The herd stampeded. Mara barely had time to react. She pulled her horse hard to the left, narrowly avoiding being trampled as the cattle surged past, a wall of muscle and hooves and blind terror. She lost sight of Rhett, lost sight of Tomas, lost sight of everything except the rain and the dark and the thunder of hooves on wet ground. Her horse stumbled, nearly went down, caught itself at the last second. Mara held on, her hands locked on the reins, her legs clamped tight. The world was noise and movement and fear. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The herd slowed, confused, milling in the rain. The thunder moved off to the east. The lightning faded. Mara sat on her trembling horse, gasping for air, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Rhett!" she shouted. "Tomas!" No answer. Panic clawed at her throat. She turned her horse, riding through the scattered herd, looking for any sign of them. The rain was lighter now, but the visibility was still terrible. She called their names again and again, her voice raw. Then she saw movement, a figure on horseback coming toward her through the gloom. "Rhett?" she called. "Yeah." His voice was rough, strained. "I'm here." Relief flooded through her, so strong it made her dizzy. "You hurt?" "Bruised. You?" "Same." "Where's Tomas?" The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Mara's stomach twisted. "I don't know." They searched for 20 minutes that felt like hours, calling his name, riding in widening circles. The rain stopped completely, leaving the world wet and cold and silent. Mara's hope was fading fast, replaced by something darker. Then Rhett shouted, "Over here!" Mara rode hard toward his voice and found him kneeling beside a still figure on the ground. Tomas was lying on his side, his leg twisted at a wrong angle, his face pale. "Tomas!" Mara dismounted, dropping beside him. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. "Yeah, I can hear you." "What hurts?" "Everything." He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Horse went down, through me. Think my leg's broken." Mara's chest tightened. A broken leg out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no doctor and no time. It was a death sentence. "We'll get you fixed up," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mara, don't. We'll figure it out." Rhett was already pulling supplies from his saddlebag. Rope, cloth, a knife. He cut a straight branch from a nearby tree, cleaned it quickly, and looked at Tomas. "This is going to hurt." "Everything hurts," Tomas said. "Do it." They set the leg as best they could, working quickly and carefully. Tomas didn't scream, but the sound he made was worse. A low, animal groan that cut through Mara like glass. When it was done, they wrapped the splint tight and helped him onto Rhett's horse. "I can't ride in this condition," Tomas said, his voice weak. "I'll slow you down." "We're not leaving you," Mara said. "You have to. You're 2 weeks from the deadline." "I don't care." "Mara." "I said I don't care." Her voice cracked. "I'm not leaving you out here to die. We'll make it work." Tomas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes wet. Then he nodded, too exhausted to argue. They made a rough camp in the mud, no fire, no food, just exhaustion and fear, and the cold seeping into their bones. Rhett checked the herd. They'd lost another 8 head in the stampede, and the rest were scattered over a mile. It would take most of tomorrow just to gather them. Mara sat beside Tomas, holding his hand while he slept fitfully. Across the camp, Rhett stood watch, his rifle across his knees, his face unreadable. She'd never felt more alone. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the sky still heavy with clouds. Mara woke stiff and sore, every muscle screaming. Tomas was awake, but feverish, his forehead hot to the touch. They gave him water and tried to make him comfortable, but there was only so much they could do. "We need to get him to a doctor," Rhett said quietly. "The nearest town's 40 miles, Mara said. "He won't make it." "He won't make it if we don't try." She knew he was right. She also knew that if they took Tomas to Grafton, they'd lose at least 3 days, maybe more. 3 days they didn't have. "You take him," she said finally. Rhett stared at her. "What?" "Take him to Grafton. Get him to a doctor. I'll keep the herd moving." "By yourself?" "I've done harder things." "That's insane." "It's the only option." Mara met his eyes. "If we all go, we lose the ranch. If we all stay, Tomas dies. This way, at least one of us has a chance." "Mara, please." The word came out raw. "Just do this for me." Rhett looked at her for a long time, something unreadable moving across his face.
Then he nodded slowly. All right, but I'm coming back. I know. They loaded Tomas onto the gentlest horse they had, securing him as best they could. Mara handed Rhett most of their remaining supplies, food, water, money for the doctor. Be careful, she said. You too. Rhett paused, then reached out and touched her shoulder. Just briefly, just enough to ground her. You're stronger than you think. I hope you're right. She watched them ride east, two figures growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the gray horizon. Then she turned back to the herd, alone in the vastness, and started gathering cattle. The work was brutal. Without help, every task took twice as long and hurt 3 times as much. Mara rode until her legs went numb, until her voice gave out from shouting, until she couldn't tell the difference between exhaustion and despair. She found scattered cattle in gullies and thickets, drove them back to the main group, started the slow push north again. Days blurred together. She slept in the saddle, ate jerky and hardtack, drank water that tasted like rust. At night she lay on the ground and stared at the stars, too tired to cry, too stubborn to quit. On the 3rd day alone, wolves came. She heard them first, a sound like wind through rocks, except it wasn't wind. Mara jerked awake from where she dozed against her saddle, her hand already reaching for the rifle. The fire had burned down to coals, barely enough light to see by, but she didn't need light to know what that sound meant. The cattle knew too. They were shifting, restless, making low, anxious noises in the dark. Mara stood slowly, every muscle protesting, and scanned the shadows beyond the firelight. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then she saw them. Yellow eyes reflecting the dim glow of the coals, low shapes moving through the grass. 4 of them. Maybe 5. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She'd seen wolf kills before, seen what they could do to a herd when they got bold enough. And these wolves were bold, hungry too, probably, with the drought driving game away, and desperation making them stupid. Mara raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighted on the closest pair of eyes, and fired. The shot cracked through the night like thunder. The wolf yelped and bolted, but she didn't know if she'd hit it or just scared it. The herd exploded into motion, cattle scattering in every direction, bellowing in panic. Mara swore and ran for her horse, jamming her boot into the stirrup and swinging up even as Cinder was already moving. The wolves scattered too, melting back into the darkness. But Mara knew they wouldn't go far. They'd circle back, test the edges, wait for another chance. And with the herd scattered and only one person to defend them, the wolves had all the advantage. She rode hard through the dark, trying to turn the cattle back, shouting until her throat was raw. Some of them responded, but others just kept running, blind with fear. She lost count of how many broke away into the night. Lost count of how many shots she fired at shadows that might have been wolves or might have been nothing. Lost count of everything except the desperate need to keep moving, keep fighting, keep the herd together by sheer force of will. By the time the sky started to lighten in the east, Mara was shaking with exhaustion. The wolves were gone, for now, but the damage was done. The herd was scattered over 2 miles of rough country, and she'd already found 3 dead cattle, their throats torn open, flies gathering in the growing heat. She sat on her horse and stared at the carnage, feeling something inside her start to crack. This was impossible. She'd known it from the start, but knowing and feeling were 2 different things. 3 people had barely been enough. 2 people might have managed. But 1 person alone, trying to move 260 head of cattle through hostile country with no help and no time, it was suicide. Mara closed her eyes and tried to remember why she was doing this, tried to remember her father's face, the ranch, the life she was fighting for. But all she could see was dirt and blood and yellow eyes in the dark. She wanted to quit. The thought came clear and sharp, cutting through the fog of exhaustion. She could just leave the herd here, ride to the nearest town, send a telegram to the bank saying she was done. Let them foreclose. Let the Drummonds have the land. Let it all go and find some other life, some easier life, somewhere that didn't require her to break herself into pieces just to survive. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. Because quitting meant her father had died for nothing. Quitting meant every man who'd ever doubted her was right. Quitting meant Tomas had broken his leg for a lost cause, and Rhett had wasted his time on a fool's errand. Quitting meant she was exactly as weak as they all believed. Mara opened her eyes, looked at the dead cattle one more time, then turned her horse and started gathering the living ones. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, writing a grid pattern, calling to the cattle in a voice that was more croak than shout. Some came willingly. Others had to be chased down and driven back. By the time the sun started its descent, she'd recovered maybe 180 head. The rest were either dead or gone, and she didn't have the strength to look for them. Chalsasm. She made camp early, too exhausted to push any farther. The herd was quiet, worn down by fear and miles. Mara built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat staring into the flames while she chewed on hardtack that tasted like cardboard. Her hands were shaking. She held them out, watching the tremor, trying to make it stop through sheer will. It didn't work. Nothing worked. She was falling apart, piece by piece, and there was no one here to see it, no one to care, no one to tell her it would be all right. She pulled her knees up to her chest and pressed her forehead against them, trying to breathe through the tightness in her throat. Don't cry. Don't you dare cry. But the tears came anyway, hot and bitter, and once they started, they wouldn't stop. She cried for her father, for the ranch, for Tomas lying broken in some doctor's office in a town she'd never seen. She cried for herself, for the girl she'd been before the world got hard, before survival became the only thing that mattered. She cried until there was nothing left, until she was empty and hollow, and so tired she could barely sit upright. When it was over, she wiped her face with her sleeve, took a shaky breath, and stared at the fire. Tomorrow she'd keep moving. Tomorrow she'd find more cattle, push them farther north, fight off whatever came next. Tomorrow she'd be strong again. But tonight she let herself be broken. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Mara's hand was on her rifle before she was fully conscious, her body moving on instinct. She sat up, blinking in the pre-dawn light, and saw a rider approaching from the east. For a moment her heart leapt, Rhett, but then the light shifted and she saw it wasn't him. The rider was smaller, leaner, sitting a horse that looked too good for the territory. As he got closer, Mara saw his face and her stomach dropped. Ethan Drummond. He rode into camp like he owned it, reining in his horse a few feet from the fire. He looked fresh, clean, like he'd just stepped out of a hotel instead of riding through the wilderness. His smile was sharp and cold. "Morning, Mara." She stood slowly, keeping the rifle in her hands. "What are you doing here?" "Heard you were having trouble." He dismounted, brushing dust off his jacket. "Thought I'd come see if the rumors were true." "I'm fine. You look like hell." "Thanks." Ethan walked closer, his eyes scanning the scattered herd, the makeshift camp, the exhaustion written all over her. "Where's your crew? Taking care of business." "So you're alone?" Mara didn't answer. Ethan's smile widened. "You can't do this by yourself. You know that, right? Even if you somehow manage to get this herd to Cheyenne, you'll be too late. The bank's already started foreclosure proceedings." "That's a lie." "Is it?" He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, held it up. "Foreclosure notice. Posted in Red Hollow 3 days ago. Your property goes to auction in 10 days. Even if you make it to Cheyenne, even if you get top dollar, you won't make it back in time to stop the sale." Mara's vision blurred at the edges. "You're lying. Read it yourself." He tossed the paper at her feet. She didn't pick it up. Couldn't, because if it was real, if the bank had already moved forward with foreclosure, then everything she was doing was pointless. She'd broken Tomas, driven herself into the ground, lost cattle and sleep and pieces of her soul, and it was all for nothing. "My father's prepared to make you an offer," Ethan said, his voice smooth. "A good one. More than the property's worth, honestly. You take the money, pay off your debts, start fresh somewhere else. Hell, you could even stay in Red Hollow if you wanted. Buy a little house in town, live like a normal woman for once." "I don't want to be normal." "Then you want to be dead? Because that's where this ends, Mara. You dying alone out here with nothing to show for it." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth under the fake concern. He didn't care about her, neither did his father. They just wanted the land, wanted to carve up her ranch and add it to their empire, and they'd use her desperation to get it cheap. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mara, get the hell out of my camp." Ethan's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be the first time." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "When you fail, and you will fail, don't come crying to me. This was your last chance.
I'll take my chances." He mounted his horse, looked down at her one more time, then rode off without another word. Mara watched him go, her hands clenched so tight her nails cut into her palms. When he was out of sight, she finally picked up the paper he'd thrown. It was real. A legal notice, posted by the Red Hollow Bank, announcing the foreclosure and auction of the Whitlock Ranch. Date of sale, August 25th. Terms, cash only, no exceptions. Mara read it 3 times, the words blurring together. 10 days. She had 10 days to get to Cheyenne, sell the herd, and ride back. It was 140 miles to Cheyenne, another 140 back. Pushing hard, with a good horse and no herd to slow her down, she could maybe cover 50 miles a day. That was 6 days of riding, which left 4 days to sell the herd and handle the paperwork. It was tight. Dangerously tight. But it was possible, if nothing else went wrong. Mara folded the paper and shoved it in her pocket. Then she saddled Cinder, scattered the fire, and started pushing the herd north again. She rode for 3 more days alone, pushing herself and the cattle past the point of exhaustion. The land changed as she moved farther north. More trees, greener grass, water that didn't taste like dust. The cattle fattened up a little, and the miles came easier, but Mara was fading fast. She wasn't eating enough, wasn't sleeping enough, wasn't doing anything except riding and surviving. On the 8th day, she reached the South Platte River. It was wider than she expected, running fast and brown with snowmelt from the mountains. The crossing looked treacherous, sandbars and hidden currents and water deep enough to drown a horse. Mara sat on the bank, staring at it, trying to figure out how one person was supposed to push 180 head of nervous cattle across a river that wanted to kill them. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Mara turned, heart jumping, hand going to her rifle. Then she saw who it was and felt something break loose in her chest. Rhett. He rode toward her on his gray gelding, looking tired and dusty, but whole, alive, real. Mara dismounted without thinking, her legs shaky, and met him as he swung down from the saddle. "You came back," she said, her voice rough. "I said I would." "I thought—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "How's Tomas?" "Alive. Legs set properly, and the doctor said he'll heal. Might walk with a limp, but he'll walk." Rhett's eyes searched her face. "You look like you've been through hell." "Close enough. How many head did you lose?" "About 80. Wolves got some, others just scattered." Mara gestured toward the river. "I was trying to figure out how to cross that." Rhett looked at the water, his expression unreadable. "We'll figure it out together." The relief that flooded through her was so strong it made her knees weak. She wanted to say something, wanted to thank him or tell him what it meant that he'd come back, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she just nodded. They crossed the river the next morning, working together to push the herd through the current. It was brutal, dangerous work, cattle balking at the water's edge, others getting swept downstream, one nearly drowning before Rhett roped it and dragged it to shore. But they made it, all of them. And when Mara stood on the far bank, soaked and shivering and exhausted, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. They made camp on the north side of the river, building a proper fire for the first time in a week. Rhett cooked bacon and beans while Mara changed into dry clothes behind the supply wagon. When she came back, he handed her a plate without comment. She ate fast, shoveling food into her mouth like she was afraid it might disappear. Rhett watched her with something that might have been concern. "When's the last time you ate a real meal?" he asked. "Don't remember." "You're going to collapse if you keep this up." "I'll collapse after we sell the herd." "I'm fine." She set the plate down, wiped her mouth. "How far to Cheyenne?" "About 60 miles, 3 days if we push." "We push." Rhett was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Ethan Drummond came to see you." Mara's head snapped up. "How did you know that?" "Ran into him on the road to Grafton. He made some comments about how you were out here dying alone." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Took everything I had not to knock his teeth in." "He showed me a foreclosure notice, said the auction's in 10 days. Is it real?" "Yeah." Rhett swore quietly. "That changes things." "No, it doesn't. We just have to move faster." "Mara, even if we get to Cheyenne in time, even if we sell the herd, you still have to ride back and stop the auction. That's cutting it too close." "Then I'll cut it close." She met his eyes. I'm not giving up. Not now. Not after everything. He looked at her for a long time, something complicated moving across his face. Then he said, "You're the stubbornest person I've ever met." You already said that. It bears repeating. Despite everything, Mara smiled, just a little, just enough. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne on the 11th day, the city rising out of the grassland like a promise. Mara had forgotten how big it was. Buildings 3 and 4 stories tall, streets crowded with wagons and people, the sound of hammers and saws and voices blending into a constant roar. After weeks of silence broken only by wind and cattle, the noise was overwhelming. They drove the herd to the stockyards on the east side of town, corralling them in pens that smelled like manure and old hay. Mara counted heads, 172 left out of the nearly 300 they'd started with. The losses hurt, but there was no time to dwell on them. She had to find a buyer, negotiate a price, and close the deal before the day was over. Rhett stayed with the herd while Mara cleaned up as best she could, washing her face in a horse trough, braiding her hair, changing into the one clean shirt she had left. She still looked rough, but there was nothing she could do about that. The buyer's offices were in a low brick building near the rail depot. Mara walked in with her head up and her spine straight, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Inside, the air smelled like cigar smoke and old wood. A clerk looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. "Help you?" "I'm here to see a buyer. I've got cattle to sell." "Where's your boss?" "I am the boss." The clerk's eyebrows went up. "You're the rancher? That a problem?" "No, ma'am, just unusual." He stood, gestured toward a door. "Mr. Hastings is available. Through there." Mara walked through the door into an office where a heavy-set man with a gray beard sat behind a desk covered in papers. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from curiosity to skepticism in the space of a breath. "You're the rancher?" he said. "Mara Whitlock. I've got 172 head in the yards. Good stock, ready to ship." Hastings leaned back in his chair. "Where'd you drive them from?" "Red Hollow, Colorado Territory." "Long drive?" "Yes, sir." "You do it alone?" "Had help." Hastings studied her for a moment, his eyes taking in her dusty clothes, her sun-darkened skin, the exhaustion she couldn't quite hide. "I'll have my men look at the stock. If they're as good as you say, I'll make you an offer." "I need a decision today." "Today?" He frowned. "That's not how this works. Inspection takes time. I don't have time." Mara stepped closer to the desk. "I need to sell this herd today and ride back to Colorado by tomorrow. The stock's healthy, well-fed, and ready to go. You inspect them now, and we settle this before the sun goes down." Hastings looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "You got a reason for the rush?" "My ranch is being auctioned in 8 days. I need the money to stop it." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, exactly, but understanding. He'd probably seen 100 desperate ranchers walk through this door, and most of them hadn't made it. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take a look. But if the stock's not what you say, the deal's off." "Fair enough." They walked to the stockyards together, Hastings moving with the slow deliberation of a man who'd spent his life evaluating livestock. Mara led him to the pens where her cattle waited, tired and dusty, but alive. Rhett stood nearby, watching. Hastings climbed the fence, looked over the herd, then dropped back down. He walked among the cattle, checking hooves and teeth and coats, his face giving nothing away. Mara stood outside the pen, her hands clenched, her heart hammering. Finally, Hastings came back. "They're thin. They've been on the trail for 10 days. Still thin." He pulled a notebook from his pocket, did some quick math. "I'll give you $5 a head." Mara's stomach dropped. $5 a head for 172 cattle was $860, not even half what she needed. "That's robbery," she said. "That's the market. The market in Kansas is paying $7. This isn't Kansas. And I'm not an idiot." Mara stepped closer. "These cattle are healthy, well-bred, and trail-ready. You're lowballing me because you think I'm desperate." "Aren't you?" "Yes, but I'm not stupid." She held his gaze. $7 a head. That's my price." Hastings shook his head. "Can't do it." "Then I'll find someone who will." She turned to walk away, her heart in her throat. It was a bluff. She didn't have time to find another buyer, but she sold it hard, her stride confident, her shoulders square. Wait. Mara stopped but didn't turn around. Hastings sighed. $650, final offer. Mara did the math in her head. $650 times 172 was $1,118. Enough to pay off the bank with a little left over. Barely enough, but enough. She turned back. Deal. They shook on it, and Hastings went back to his office to draw up the paperwork. Mara stood by the pens, her legs shaking, her mind racing. She'd done it. Against every odd, through every disaster, she'd gotten the herd to Cheyenne and sold them for enough to save the ranch. Now she just had to get home before the auction. Rhett walked over, his expression unreadable. You did good. Not done yet. I know. They finalized the sale by sunset, Hastings counting out cash and signing papers, while Mara watched with barely concealed impatience. When it was over, she shoved the money into a leather pouch, tied it tight, and headed for the livery. I'm riding back tonight, she told Rhett. You should stay here, rest up, head back when you're ready. Like hell. Rhett, you're not riding 140 miles alone in the dark. His voice was firm. We go together or we don't go at all. Mara wanted to argue, but the truth was she didn't want to ride alone. Didn't want to face the dark and the distance and the weight of everything without someone beside her. All right, she said, but we leave now. They saddled fresh horses, bought supplies, and rode out of Cheyenne as the stars came out. The night was cool and clear, the road stretching out ahead of them like a ribbon of silver. Mara pushed her horse hard, faster than was safe, but Rhett kept pace without complaint. They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to water the horses and catch a few hours of sleep. The land blurred past, grassland and hills and dry creek beds. Mara's body screamed for rest, but she ignored it, driving herself forward through sheer force of will. On the third day, she saw Red Hollow on the horizon. They rode into Red Hollow 3 hours before the auction was set to begin, their horses stumbling with exhaustion, their own bodies so worn down that dismounting felt like falling. Mara's legs nearly gave out when her boots hit the ground, but she caught herself against Cinder's flank and forced herself upright. The town looked exactly the same as when she'd left, dusty, small, indifferent, but now it felt like enemy territory. People stopped to stare as they walked their horses down the main street. Mara could feel their eyes, could hear the whispers starting up like wind through dry grass. There she is. Can't believe she made it back. Wonder if she got the money. Bet she didn't. The Drummonds are probably already measuring her land for fence posts. Mara ignored them all. She tied Cinder to the rail outside the bank, pulled the leather pouch from her saddlebag, and checked the contents one more time. $1,118 in cash, plus the papers from Hastings proving the sale. It was all there. Everything she needed. Rhett tied his horse beside hers. You want me to come in with you? No, stay with the horses. Mara adjusted her hat, squared her shoulders. This is something I need to do alone. He nodded, understanding without needing explanation. She walked up the steps and pushed through the bank's door, the bell overhead ringing sharp and clear. Inside, the air was cool and dim, smelling of paper and dust and old money. Gerald Pritchard sat behind his desk, his suit pressed and perfect, his oiled hair gleaming in the lamplight. He looked up as Mara approached, and his expression shifted from surprise to something harder to read. Miss Whitlock, I didn't expect to see you today. I'm here to make a payment. Pritchard's eyebrows rose. The auction begins in 3 hours. Surely you're not... I said I'm here to make a payment. Oh, Mara set the leather pouch on his desk with a solid thunk. $2,000. That's what the loan was for, right? Principal and interest? Pritchard stared at the pouch like it might explode. Slowly he reached out and opened it, his fingers sorting through the cash. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. He counted the money twice, checking the bills against the light, looking for any reason to reject them. There wasn't one. This is... He cleared his throat. This is highly irregular, but it's legal. The foreclosure proceedings have already begun, and they end now. Mara leaned on the desk, her voice low and steady. You said payment in full by the deadline. This is payment in full, $2,000 cash with 3 hours to spare. Pritchard's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Around them, the bank had gone quiet. The clerk at the front desk was watching. 2 customers near the door had stopped mid-conversation. Everyone wanted to see how this played out. "I'll need to verify the authenticity of these funds," Pritchard said finally. "You do that. I'll wait." She pulled out a chair and sat down, crossing her arms, her gaze never leaving his face. Pritchard looked like he wanted to argue, but there was nothing to argue about. The money was real. The sale was legitimate. She'd met the terms of the loan down to the letter. He had no choice but to accept it. Pritchard stood, gathered the money, and walked to the back office. Mara sat alone in the chair, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was it. The moment everything came down to. If Pritchard found some loophole, some technicality, some way to reject the payment, she'd lose everything. The ranch, the fight, the past 3 weeks of hell, all of it would be for nothing. But if he accepted it, she won. Minutes crawled by like hours. Mara watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking with agonizing slowness. People came and went, casting glances her way, but no one spoke to her. She was an anomaly, a disruption, a woman who'd refused to disappear quietly. Finally, Pritchard returned. His face was stiff, his movements precise. He set a ledger on the desk, opened it, and dipped his pen in ink. "The funds are acceptable," he said, his voice flat. "The loan is hereby paid in full." Mara exhaled, the breath leaving her in a rush. "I want a receipt." "Of course." Pritchard wrote quickly, his penmanship immaculate despite the tension in his shoulders. When he finished, he blotted the ink, tore the page from the ledger, and slid it across the desk. "Your property is no longer in foreclosure. The auction is canceled." Mara took the receipt, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her pocket. Then she stood, looked Pritchard straight in the eye, and said, "Tell Cal Drummond he can go to hell." She walked out before he could respond, the bell ringing again as the door swung shut behind her. The sunlight hit her like a wall, bright and hot and real. Rhett was waiting by the horses, and when he saw her face, he smiled. "You did it." "Yeah." Mara felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for months. "I did." They mounted up and rode down the street, past the general store, past the saloon, past all the people who'd bet against her. Mara kept her head high, her spine straight. She didn't wave, didn't gloat, just rode, letting her presence do the talking. By the time they reached the edge of town, word had already spread. The Whitlock girl paid off the loan. She saved the ranch. She did the impossible. Mara didn't care what they said. She just wanted to go home. The ranch looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she'd just gotten used to distances measured in miles instead of fences. Mara dismounted in front of the house, her legs shaking, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay for weeks. Rhett caught her elbow as she stumbled, steadying her. "Easy. I'm all right. You're about to collapse." "Not yet." But even as she said it, her knees buckled. Rhett caught her before she hit the ground, his arm around her waist, holding her upright. "Inside," he said. "Now." He half carried her up the porch steps and into the house. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of dust and old coffee and home. Mara sagged against the table, breathing hard, trying to convince her body to keep functioning just a little longer. Rhett guided her to a chair. "Sit, don't move." She sat, too tired to argue. Rhett disappeared into the kitchen, and she heard the pump working, water splashing into a basin. He came back with a cup, pressed it into her hands. "Drink." She drank. The water was cold and clean and tasted better than anything she'd had in weeks. She finished the cup, set it down, and looked at Rhett. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or something deeper. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "Everything. Coming back, helping me cross the river, riding with me to Cheyenne and back." She swallowed hard. "I wouldn't have made it without you." "Yeah, you would have." Rhett crouched beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. "You're stronger than you think, Mara, stronger than anyone in this territory. You proved that." "I proved I'm stubborn." "Same thing, out here." Despite everything, she smiled. "Maybe." They sat in silence for a while, the house settling around them. Outside, the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her shoulders. She'd won. Against every odd, every obstacle, every person who'd tried to stop her, she'd won. But victory felt heavier than she'd expected. "What happens now?" Rhett asked. Mara opened her eyes. "I rebuild. Restock the herd, fix the fences, hire hands, keep the ranch running. That's a lot of work for one person. I've got Tomas. When he heals. You've got me too, if you want." Mara looked at him, really looked at him. Rhett Mercer, the drifter who'd walked into her life at the worst possible moment and decided to stay. She'd spent weeks working beside him, fighting beside him, surviving beside him. She knew the way he moved, the way he talked, the way he went quiet when he was thinking hard about something. She knew he was steady when everything else was chaos, and that he'd followed her into hell without asking for anything in return. And somewhere along the trail, between the storms and the wolves and the desperate miles, she'd started to feel something for him that went beyond gratitude. "You planning to stay?" she asked. "If you'll have me." "As what? A hired hand?" Rhett's mouth quirked. "I was thinking more as a partner." Mara's heart kicked against her ribs. "A partner?" "Yeah. Someone who works beside you, not for you. Someone who shares the load." He paused. "Someone who stays." The word hung in the air between them. Stays. Not drifts, not moves on when things get hard. Stays. Mara didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long fighting alone, so long believing that needing someone was the same as weakness, that the idea of partnership felt foreign. But when she looked at Rhett, she didn't see weakness. She saw strength of a different kind, the kind that came from two people choosing to stand together instead of falling apart alone. "I don't know how to do that," she said quietly. "Share things, I mean. My father raised me to be independent, to handle everything myself. Independence is good, but it's not the same as being alone." "What's the difference?" "Independence means you can survive on your own. Being alone means you have to." Rhett stood, offering his hand. "I'm not asking you to give up who you are, Mara. I'm just asking you to let someone stand beside you while you do it." She looked at his hand, calloused, scarred, steady, and something in her chest cracked open. She reached up and took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "All right," she said. "Partners?" His smile was slow and genuine. "Partners." They stood there in the fading light, hands still clasped, the silence between them comfortable and full. Then Rhett let go, stepped back, and nodded toward the door. "You should rest. I'll check on the horses, make sure everything's secure." "Rhett." He paused, turning back. Mara wanted to say something more, wanted to find words for the tangled mess of feelings in her chest, but she didn't know how. So instead, she just said, "I'm glad you stayed." "Me too." He walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Mara stood alone at the quiet house, listening to the sound of his boots on the porch steps, and for the first time in months, she felt something that wasn't exhaustion or fear or desperation. She felt hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work. Mara and Rhett threw themselves into rebuilding, repairing the damage that months of neglect and desperation had caused. They mended fences, cleared irrigation ditches, patched the barn roof, and restocked the larder with supplies bought from money left over from the cattle sale. Tomas returned from Grafton walking with a cane, his legs still healing but his spirits high, and the three of them settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Word spread quickly through Red Hollow. Mara Whitlock had survived. More than that, she'd won. People who'd written her off as a failure suddenly found reasons to ride out to the ranch, offering congratulations that felt hollow and late. Mara accepted them with cool politeness, but she didn't forget who'd stood with her and who'd waited to see which way the wind blew. The Drummonds stayed away. Mara heard through town gossip that Cal had been furious when the auction was canceled, that he'd tried to pressure Pritchard into finding some legal loophole, but the bank manager had refused. The loan was paid. The foreclosure was void. There was nothing left to contest. Ethan sent a letter. Mara burned it without reading it. One afternoon in early September, Mara and Rhett rode out to check the western pasture. The grass was still thin from the drought, but there were signs of recovery, green shoots pushing through the brown, wildflowers blooming in patches, the land slowly healing itself. They dismounted near a stand of cottonwoods and let the horses graze while they stood in the shade. "It's coming back," Rhett said, looking out over the pasture. "Slowly. That's how things heal. Slowly." Mara nodded, her arms crossed. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "What do you mean?" "I keep waiting for something else to go wrong. For the bank to find a mistake, for the herd to get sick, for—" She stopped, frustrated. "I don't know. I spent so long fighting that I don't know what to do now that the fight's over." Rhett turned to face her. "The fight's not over. It's just different now." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you fought to keep the ranch. Now you have to fight to make it thrive. That's harder in a lot of ways. Takes longer, less dramatic." He smiled slightly. "But it matters just as much." Mara considered that. "You planning to stick around for that fight?" "Already told you I was. People say a lot of things." "I'm not people." Rhett stepped closer, his expression serious. "I know you've been let down before. I know trusting someone is hard when you've had to do everything yourself, but I'm not going anywhere, Mara. Not unless you tell me to." She looked up at him, this man who'd become so much more than just a hired hand. They'd been through hell together, had seen each other at their worst, had survived things that should have broken them. And somewhere in all of that, she'd stopped thinking of him as a stranger and started thinking of him as something else. "What if I told you I don't want a partner?" she said quietly. "What if I told you I want something more?" Rhett went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't know how to do this. Relationships, feelings, any of it. My father never taught me, and I've spent so long believing I didn't need anyone that I don't even know where to start." Mara took a breath. "But I know I don't want you to just be my business partner. I want—" She stopped, the words sticking in her throat. Rhett waited, patient, giving her space to find them. "I want you to stay for me," she finished. "Not for the ranch. For me." Something shifted in his expression, softening it. "I already am." "You are?" "Yeah." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing against her sun-darkened skin. "I'm staying because somewhere between Red Hollow and Cheyenne, I fell in love with you, with your stubbornness and your strength, and the way you refuse to quit even when the whole world's telling you to. I'm staying because I can't imagine being anywhere else." Mara's breath caught. "You love me?" "Yeah, I do." She stared at him, trying to process the words, trying to understand how someone could look at her, rough and difficult and broken in places, and see something worth loving. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth of it. He wasn't lying, wasn't exaggerating. He meant it. "I don't know if I know how to love someone," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I'm any good at it." "You don't have to be good at it. You just have to try." Mara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his hand against her face, the warmth of him standing so close. She thought about all the ways she'd been taught to be strong, alone, independent, unyielding. And she thought about what Rhett had said earlier. Independence means you can survive on your own. Being alone means you have to. She didn't want to be alone anymore. "All right," she whispered. "I'll try." Rhett smiled, and then he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was giving her space to pull away if she wanted. But Mara didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting under her feet. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Rhett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "We're going to be all right," he said quietly. "You promise?" "Yeah, I promise." And for the first time in a long time, Mara believed it. They were married in October, a small ceremony on the ranch with Tomas as witness. No church, no guests, no fuss. Just the three of them standing under the cottonwoods with the mountains rising in the distance and the sky stretched wide overhead. Mara wore a simple dress she'd borrowed from a neighbor, and Rhett wore his cleanest shirt. Tomas read from a book of poetry he'd carried since he was young, words about love and partnership and choosing each other every day. When it was over, Rhett kissed her again, and Mara felt something settle deep in her chest. This was right. This was home. They spent the winter preparing for spring, building up the herd slowly, carefully, making sure every decision was sound. Rhett proved to be as good at ranching as he'd claimed, with an eye for livestock and a head for numbers that complemented Mara's instincts. They argued sometimes, both of them too stubborn to back down easily, but they always worked it out, always found a way to meet in the middle. Tomas healed slowly, his leg never quite the same, but he refused to retire. He took on lighter duties, managing the books and handling supply runs to town, leaving the heavy work to Mara and Rhett. At night, the three of them sat around the kitchen table, planning the future, arguing about feed prices and breeding stock and whether they should expand the operation or consolidate. It felt like family. By spring, the ranch was thriving. They'd added 50 head of cattle, hired 2 steady hands, and cleared enough profit to start thinking about expansion. Mara stood on the porch one morning, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, and felt a contentment she hadn't known was possible. Rhett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come." "We've come pretty far. You think it'll last?" "Nothing lasts forever, but we'll make it last as long as we can." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's all anyone can do." Mara leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had become her anchor. She thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, desperate, alone, fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win. That girl was gone now, replaced by someone harder and softer at the same time. Someone who'd learned that strength didn't mean standing alone. It meant knowing when to reach out, when to trust, when to let someone else carry part of the weight. "I love you," she said quietly. Rhett's arms tightened around her. "I love you too." They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, turning the world from shadow into light. Below them, the ranch stretched out in all its imperfect glory. Fences that needed mending, pastures that needed seeding, a barn that sagged in places but stood nonetheless. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Spring turned to summer, and with it came the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the grass turn brittle. But this year, Mara watched the drought with different eyes. She'd lived through worse, survived worse, and now she had the resources to weather it. A full herd, money in the bank, and 2 good men working beside her. The ranch had become something her father would have been proud of. Maybe even something more than what he'd built, though Mara tried not to think in those terms. It felt disloyal somehow, like claiming she'd done better than the man who'd given everything to this land. But the numbers didn't lie. They were running 300 head now, had expanded the grazing land by 50 acres, and hired 4 steady hands who showed up on time and worked without complaint. Mara was in the barn one afternoon, checking inventory, when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see Tomas limping in, his expression troubled. "We got visitors," he said. "Who?" "Drummonds, both of them." Mara's jaw tightened. She set down the ledger and walked outside, Rhett falling into step beside her. Cal and Ethan Drummond sat on their horses at the edge of the property, neither dismounting. Cal looked older than she remembered, his beard more gray than brown now. Ethan looked the same, cold and handsome and certain of his place in the world. Mara stopped 10 feet away, her arms crossed. "What do you want?" Cal removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "Came to talk business." "We don't have business." "Hear me out." He glanced at Rhett, then back to Mara. "I'll admit I underestimated you. Didn't think you could pull off that drive, and I sure as hell didn't think you'd make it back in time to save the ranch. But you did. That takes grit." "Is there a point to this?" "The point is, I'm a practical man. You've proven yourself. So I'm prepared to make you a new offer. A better one. $2,500 for your land, plus I'll hire you on as foreman. You can keep running cattle, keep living here. You just won't have to carry all the risk." Mara stared at him. "You want to buy my ranch, and then hire me to work my own land for you?" "It's a good deal, Mara. You'd have steady pay, no debt, no worries." "No." Cal's expression tightened. "You didn't let me finish." "I don't need to. The answer's no." Mara stepped closer, her voice hard. "You tried to bury me last year, moved up my loan deadline, spread rumors I'd fail, sent your son out here to watch me struggle. And now that I've survived, now that I've built something worth having, you want to buy it cheap and pretend like you're doing me a favor?" "That's not—" "Yeah, it is." She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with barely concealed resentment. Both of you wanted me gone because you couldn't stand the idea of a woman running a ranch better than you run yours. Well, I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. Cal's face darkened. You're making a mistake. It's my mistake to make. This territory is getting crowded, Mara. Water's scarce, grazing land's getting fought over, and you're sitting on one of the best parcels around. You think everyone's just going to let you keep it? You think playing tough is going to protect you when bigger ranchers start pushing in? I'll handle it when it happens.
You can't handle everything alone. She's not alone, Rhett said quietly. Cal's eyes flicked to him, assessing.
Who the hell are you? Her husband. The word landed heavy. Ethan's expression went flat, something ugly flickering behind his eyes. Cal looked between them, then shook his head slowly. So that's how it is. That's how it is, Mara said. Cal put his hat back on, his movements deliberate. All right, you want to do this the hard way, that's your choice. But don't come crying when things get difficult. I won't make another offer. Good. He turned his horse and rode off without another word. Ethan lingered a moment longer, his gaze locked on Mara. You could have had everything, he said. I already do. He spurred his horse and followed his father, the two of them disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Mara stood watching until they were gone, then let out a long breath. You think they'll cause trouble? Rhett asked. Probably, but not right away. She turned to face him. Cal's smart. He'll wait, look for an opening, try to find some other way to get what he wants. Then we'll be ready. Mara nodded, but the encounter had left a sour taste in her mouth. She'd thought that proving herself would be enough, that surviving the drive and paying off the debt would earn her some measure of respect. But the truth was simpler and uglier. Men like Cal Drummond didn't respect women who succeeded. They resented them. And that resentment was a slow-burning thing, the kind that waited for the right moment to catch fire. She pushed the thought aside and went back to work. There was too much to do to waste time worrying about what might happen. The herd needed tending, the fences needed checking, and they were coming up on branding season. Life on a ranch didn't pause for threats or grudges. Just kept moving, relentless and demanding, and you either kept up or got left behind. By late summer, Mara realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, missed cycles, nausea in the mornings, a bone-deep exhaustion that felt different from the usual wear of ranch work. But she'd pushed it aside, told herself it was stress or bad food, or just her body adjusting to married life. It wasn't until she fainted while mending a fence that Rhett insisted she see the doctor in town. The doctor confirmed it with a smile. About 3 months along, I'd say. You're healthy. The baby's healthy. Just take it easy, Mrs. Mercer. No heavy lifting, no long days in the saddle. Mara had nodded, thanked him, and walked out in a daze. A baby. She was going to have a baby. The thought terrified her. She didn't know the first thing about being a mother. Her own mother had died when she was too young to remember much, and she'd spent her whole life learning how to be tough instead of tender, how to survive instead of nurture.
What did she know about raising a child? Rhett found her sitting on a bench outside the doctor's office, staring at nothing. What'd he say? He asked, sitting beside her. I'm pregnant. Rhett went very still. Then a slow smile spread across his face, genuine and bright. You're serious? Yeah. That's... He stopped, laughed, pulled her into a hug. That's amazing. Mara didn't hug him back right away. She just sat there, letting him hold her, feeling the warmth of his joy and the cold weight of her own fear. What if I'm terrible at it? She said quietly. Rhett pulled back to look at her. At what? Being a mother. What if I don't know how? What if I mess it up? You won't. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. He took her hands in his. You're the strongest person I know, Mara. You fought off wolves, survived a stampede, drove a herd 200 miles with almost no help. You think raising a kid is going to be harder than that? Yes, because I can't just punch a baby in the face when it doesn't cooperate. Rhett laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. Fair point, but you'll figure it out. We'll figure it out, together. Mara wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the joy she saw in his face, but all she could feel was the weight of one more thing she couldn't afford to fail at. She didn't tell Tomas right away, couldn't find the words. But he figured it out on his own a few weeks later, when she refused to help him move a heavy crate
and he saw the way Rhett hovered protectively nearby. "You're carrying," Tomas said. Not a question. Mara nodded. His face broke into a smile so wide it made the scar on his eyebrow crinkle. "About damn time." "Tomas, your father would be proud, mija. So proud." He pulled her into a careful hug, his voice thick. "You're going to be a wonderful mother." "How do you know?" "Because you don't quit. And that's the most important thing a parent can teach a child." He pulled back, his eyes wet. "How to keep going when everything's hard. How to fight for what matters. You already know how to do that." Mara's throat tightened. "I'm scared." "Good. That means you care." Thomas squeezed her shoulder. "Scared is fine. Scared means you'll pay attention, work hard, do everything you can to get it right. Your baby's lucky to have you." Mara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She excused herself and walked to the far pasture, needing space to think. Rhett found her there an hour later, sitting under the cottonwoods. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know." She picked at the grass. "Everything's changing so fast. A year ago, I was alone, broke, about to lose everything. Now I've got a ranch that's thriving, a husband, a baby on the way. It feels like too much. Like something has to break." "Nothing has to break. Things always break." Rhett sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're right. Things break. Life gets hard. But that doesn't mean you're going to fail. It just means you're going to have to keep fighting, and you're good at that." "I'm tired of fighting." "I know, but the good news is you don't have to do it alone anymore." He put his arm around her shoulders. "I'm here. Tomas is here. We're going to help you raise this kid, help you run the ranch, help you with whatever comes next. You don't have to carry everything yourself." Mara leaned against him, closing her eyes. "I'm not used to that." "I know, but you'll get used to it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Give it time." Time moved differently once she knew about the baby. The days felt slower, heavier, her body changing in ways that made ranch work harder. She couldn't ride as long, couldn't lift as much, couldn't push herself the way she used to. It frustrated her, made her feel useless, but Rhett and Tomas picked up the slack without complaint. By fall, her belly was round and obvious. The ranch hands treated her with a careful politeness that made her want to scream. Even the cattle seemed to sense her condition, moving slower when she worked them, as if they understood she was fragile now. She hated it, hated feeling weak, hated being treated like glass, hated the way her body no longer obeyed her will. But underneath the frustration was something else, something she didn't have a name for, a quiet anticipation, a strange kind of hope. One evening in October, she and Rhett sat on the porch watching the sunset. Mara had her feet propped up on the railing, her hands resting on her belly. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs, and she winced. "Active tonight," Rhett said. "Active every night." Mara rubbed the spot where the kick had landed. "I think this kid's going to be trouble." "Takes after the mother." "Damn right." Rhett smiled, reaching over to rest his hand on her belly. The baby kicked again, and his expression softened. "You picked a name yet?" "No. Have you?" "I've been thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. "If it's a girl, maybe Clara. That was my sister's name." Mara looked at him. He'd mentioned his sister before, but only briefly, and always with a pain he tried to hide. "You want to name her after someone you lost?" "Yeah, feels right. Like she'd still be part of things, you know?" He paused. "But only if you're all right with it." Mara thought about that. Thought about carrying forward the names of people who'd mattered, keeping them alive in some small way. "Clara's a good name. And if it's a boy?" "Thomas. After Tomas." Rhett's smile widened. He'd like that. He'd probably cry. "Definitely." They sat in comfortable silence, the sky turning from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, scattered across the darkness like seeds. Mara felt the baby move again, gentler this time, and she pressed her hand over Rhett's. "You think we're ready for this?" she asked. "No, but nobody ever is." "That's not reassuring." Wasn't trying to be reassuring, was trying to be honest. He squeezed her hand. "We'll figure it out, same way we've figured out everything else. One day at a time." Mara nodded slowly. One day at a time. She could do that. She'd done harder things. The baby came in late November, 2 weeks early and stubborn as hell. Labor lasted 14 hours, and Mara cursed through most of it. Cursed Rhett for putting her in this position, cursed her body for betraying her, cursed the universe for making childbirth so brutal. The doctor from town stayed the whole time, calm and steady, while Rhett held her hand and Tomas paced the hallway outside. When it was finally over, when the doctor placed the tiny screaming bundle in her arms, Mara felt something shift inside her chest. The baby was small and red-faced and furious at being born, her fists clenched tight, her lungs working overtime. "It's a girl," the doctor said, smiling. Mara stared down at her daughter, this impossibly small person who'd just turned her entire world sideways. Clara. They'd call her Clara. She had Rhett's nose and Mara's dark hair, and when she finally stopped screaming long enough to open her eyes, Mara saw her own stubbornness reflected back at her. "She's perfect," Rhett whispered, leaning over them both. "She's loud," Mara said, but her voice was soft. "Takes after the mother. Shut up." He laughed, pressing a kiss to Mara's forehead, then to Clara's. "You did good. I feel like I got trampled by a horse." "You look like it too." Mara elbowed him weakly, but she was smiling, exhausted, sore, overwhelmed, but smiling. Tomas came in a few minutes later, moving slowly on his cane, his eyes already wet. When he saw the baby, he stopped in the doorway and just stared. "Come here," Mara said. He walked over, peered down at Clara, and his face crumpled. "She's beautiful. We're naming her Clara, after Rhett's sister." "Good name." Thomas reached out with one weathered hand, gently touching the baby's tiny fingers. Clara grabbed onto his thumb, holding tight. "Strong grip. She's going to be a rancher." "Or a bank robber," Rhett said. "Or both," Mara added. They laughed, the sound quiet and warm, filling the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but inside everything felt safe. Solid. Real. Mara looked down at her daughter and thought about all the things she wanted to teach her. How to ride, how to rope, how to stand up when the world tried to knock you down. How to be strong without being hard. How to ask for help without feeling weak. How to fight for what mattered and let go of what didn't. But mostly, she wanted to teach her that you didn't have to choose between being tough and being loved. You could be both. You could survive and thrive, fight and surrender, stand alone and lean on others. You could be whole. The first year with Clara was chaos. Sleepless nights, endless crying, the constant fear that Mara was doing everything wrong. But Rhett was there through all of it, changing diapers and walking the floor at 3 a.m, and somehow managing to make her laugh even when she was too tired to stand. Tomas helped too, his gentle presence a steadying force when everything felt like it was spinning out of control. The ranch kept running. They hired more help to pick up the slack, and Mara slowly learned to delegate, something that went against every instinct she had, but which became necessary when she realized she couldn't do everything herself anymore. She still rode out when she could, still checked the herd and made decisions about breeding and sales. But she also learned to trust her crew, to let them handle things she would have insisted on doing herself a year ago. It was hard, but it worked. By the time Clara turned 1, the Whitlock Mercer Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the territory. They were running 400 head, had expanded their land holdings, and were turning a profit that would have made Mara's father proud. Other ranchers came to them for advice. The bank that had tried to foreclose now courted their business. Even the people in Red Hollow who'd whispered about Mara's failure now nodded respectfully when she rode through town. She'd proven them all wrong, and it felt good. One afternoon in late spring, Mara sat on the porch watching Clara toddle around the yard, chasing chickens with shrieking laughter. Rhett was working nearby, repairing a section of fence, while Tomas dozed in a chair with his hat pulled low over his face. The air was warm, the sky was clear, and for the first time in years, Mara felt something close to peace. "You look happy," Rhett said, walking over. "I am," she smiled up at him. "Weird, right?" "Not weird. Earned." He sat down beside her, watching Clara stumble and catch herself. "You ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time." "You ever regret it? Any of it?" Mara thought about that. Thought about the drive, the fear, the exhaustion, the moments when she'd wanted to quit. Thought about the losses, the cattle they'd lost, the sleep they'd sacrificed, the pieces of herself she'd had to break off to keep moving forward. No, she said finally. I don't regret it. It was hell. But it brought me here. Brought me you. Brought me Clara. Brought me this life. So no, I don't regret it. Rhett nodded slowly. Good, because I don't either. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter play. Clara had inherited Mara's stubbornness and Rhett's steadiness, along with a fearless streak that promised trouble down the line. But that was all right. Trouble was part of life on a ranch. You learned to handle it. You think she'll want this? Mara asked. The ranch, I mean, when she's older. Maybe, maybe not, but at least she'll have the choice. Rhett reached over and took her hand. That's all we can give her. Options we didn't have. Freedom to be whoever she wants to be. Even if she wants to be a bank robber? Especially then. Mara laughed, squeezing his hand. She looked out over the land, her land, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it made her chest ache. She'd fought for this, bled for it, nearly died for it, and in the end, she'd won. Not because she was perfect or fearless or special, but because she'd refused to quit. Because she'd learned to accept help. Because she'd found people worth fighting beside. Cal Drummond never made another offer. He died 3 years later, and Ethan took over the family ranch. He left Mara alone after that, too proud to acknowledge her success, but smart enough not to challenge it. Other ranchers came and went, some succeeding, others failing, the territory shifting and changing the way places do when time moves forward. But the Whitlock-Mercer Ranch endured. Years passed. Clara grew into a fierce, bright-eyed girl who rode like she was born in the saddle and argued like she was destined for law school. Mara and Rhett had 2 more children, a boy they named Thomas and another girl they called Emma. The ranch expanded, doubled in size, became one of the cornerstones of the region. Tomas lived to see all 3 grandchildren grow, walking them through their first rides and teaching them the things he'd taught Mara a lifetime ago. On the day Tomas died, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 73, Mara stood at his grave and cried harder than she'd cried since her father passed. He'd been more than a foreman, more than a friend. He'd been family in every way that mattered. They buried him under the cottonwoods, in the place where he'd spent so many afternoons watching the herd. Clara, who was 15 by then, carved his name into a wooden marker herself. Thomas Valles. Friend. Father. Home. Life kept moving. Seasons turned. The land changed and stayed the same. Clara took over more of the ranch work as she got older, showing the same fierce determination that had driven Mara through the worst times of her life. Thomas proved to be a natural horseman. Emma had her mother's head for numbers and ran the books with ruthless efficiency. Mara watched them grow and felt a pride so deep it had no words. These children, her children, would never have to fight the way she'd fought, would never have to prove themselves the way she'd had to prove herself. Because she'd done that work already. She'd broken down the walls, changed the rules, forced the world to make room. On a warm summer evening, 20 years after the drive to Cheyenne, Mara and Rhett sat on the same porch where they'd sat so many times before. They were older now, their hair graying, their bodies marked by decades of hard work. But they were still here, still together, still fighting the good fight. You ever think about how it all started? Rhett asked. Sometimes. You think you'd do it again if you knew how hard it was going to be? Mara thought about that. Thought about the girl she'd been, desperate, alone, staring down a future that promised nothing but loss. Thought about the risks she'd taken, the people she'd found along the way, the life she'd built from nothing but stubbornness and will. Yeah, she said, I would. Why? Because it mattered. She looked at him. Because I mattered, and I needed to prove that. Not to the town, not to the Drummonds, not even to myself. I needed to prove it to the universe, that I could take everything it threw at me and still be standing. And you did. Yeah, I did. She smiled, reaching for his hand. We did. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Around them the ranch hummed with life. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses whinnying in the barn, children's laughter echoing from the house. It was everything Mara had fought for, everything she'd almost lost, everything she'd finally won. She'd been called wild, improper, unfit. The town had bet against her, the bank had tried to bury her, the land itself had fought her every step of the way. But she'd survived. More than that, she'd thrived, and in doing so, she'd changed the world around her. Not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through the simple act of refusing to disappear. The ranch stood. Her children thrived. Her name endured. And that, in the end, was enough. Mara Whitlock Mercer had done the impossible. She'd taken her father's dying dream and turned it into a legacy. She'd proven that strength came in many forms, that survival was its own kind of victory, and that sometimes the wildest thing you could do was simply refuse to quit. The sun dipped below the mountains, the stars came out, and Mara sat with her husband's hand in hers, surrounded by everything she'd fought for, feeling, finally, fully, at peace. The fire she'd been called by so many had built her victory, and now it warmed her home.